Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, as always, to Unqork's Twitch channel with the Uncoder. Today, we're going to whistle while we work. Well, probably not going to do any whistling, as Snow White did, but we are going to work. And I have something that was looking to build for real work. Not to say that Twitch isn't real work, but looking for something to do. And I was like, you know what? Why don't we do it on Twitch and actually just do, some live configuring and stuff that is going to be useful, hopefully for a lot of other people. And it builds on top of some of our previous Twitches where we've talked about CI/CD integrations, versioning, and things like that. And it's also going to serve as a way to highlight two brand new features that just went out in last night's staging release of Unqork. So you're going to see some new designer features and see them in action as we build against them to facilitate some more CI/CD stuff. So let's just dive right in. So let's get my screen up there. Cool. So we're going to be talking about the GitLab integration, but it doesn't have to be GitLab. It could be GitHub. It could be Bitbucket. Just effectively tying Unqork into other version control systems. By doing so, you get the benefit of the portability of codeless architecture. That's something that we've talked when we covered codeless architecture on these Twitches and anywhere else where we're covering the subject of codeless architecture. We talk about the portability of the codeless standard, that definition that sits in the middle of everything that's going on in your no code development. And so this is kind of talking to that, right? That your JSON, the representation of everything, that declarative JSON, is portable. It could live in Unqork. It could live in a VCS system like Git, and then because it's JSON, you could do additional diffing and linting and other things that you might want to do in those systems. Additionally, it allows you to hook in other processes and other tools as part of your SDLC into what's going on in Unqork, right? So while we have a number of SDLC focused tools, everything from the UDLC to capabilities of Designer, the workflow stuff that we're going to show today. There's going to be other processes you want. Like you might want to run other automated tests that are not, covered in Unqork's testing suite. Trigger those when you deploy to a GitLab and leverage their automatic pipelines and things like that. So, excuse me. So it's going to again go back into all of that stuff, and yeah. So let's go with that. So if everyone recalls, what we did with the GitLab again was on the save of a module, and I'll just start. I'll show the workflow because that's what we're going to edit first. On the save of a module, this workflow will fire off and it will commit the module into GitLab. All right, so this is the signal start node of Unqork's workflow, which allows this workflow to begin based on a signal. In this case, like an event. So the fact that a creator in Designer saved a module is the event that will trigger this signal to begin and the workflow to process. You'll see there's a second one in here that I currently have disabled, which I have it called app promote. So that is another one of the workflow signal start nodes that we have, which is it'll fire off when you promote an application or any application for that matter. Because for all of these settings, you can choose on of all modules or on of only specific modules. Same thing for applications. So the brand new flavor of a signal start node that we're going to first talk about today, and I'll just grab a new signal start node and I'll drop it into my workflow, is on save of workflows, right? So we had on save of modules, but modules are just one piece of your application, and applications are primarily composed of workflows and modules, and every workflow has a number of modules inside of it. So you can have an application with modules and workflows, an application with just modules, right? So now we can fire off a workflow to run when a workflow is saved, right? And then when that workflow gets saved, now you can start to automate a lot of your other SDLC practices around saving of a workflow, not just saving of a module. More often than not, you're going to be, I would say, generally speaking, the module is going to be the last thing that you save. I mean, you'll probably save a module after you save a workflow. But you know what? I don't have the data to support that that is any more accurate than what I just think it is. And of course, you can't rely on these automated processes being on something you think is going to happen. Of course, someone can come in, do something with the workflow, and you want to be able to capture that. So in this case, we're going to now say that we want to kick off a workflow that's going to push data into GitLab, and we're going to do it on the save. We're going to do this for a specific workflow because we're just going to focus right now on our GitLab workflow, but we can certainly turn it on for every workflow in the environment, just like we have it on for every module in the environment. But we'll start small here, and we'll just say, hey, I want to fire this off when the GitLab workflow, this one here, is saved. All right, and I'm just going to put in an end node, and we'll fill in the details later. And now, when I go to, actually, wait, let me just rename this. We'll call this workflow save. So now, when I hit save, you'll see these 3 dots now appear after the save button, which goes to indicate that when I hit this button, more is going to be shown to me, right? And what is shown to me? It is a version history. So now when I save a workflow, it's going to, one, just title it by default as the time that I'm saving it. But I can also add a description. So this is, think of this like a commit message when you're committing code into a source control repository. You got to put a message to say what it is that you did. Right? Very important for the person who's going to be reviewing these changes and for historical information. So now for each and every save of your workflow, you're going to get a version of it, and you're going to be able to contextualize that version at the time that you save. Now, this is something you can do on modules, but it's not as ingrained into the saving process, right? And as a result, it doesn't get used as heavily. I imagine that's going to change over time, but I can't promise one way or another. But this is something that has always existed for modules, right? I can go back into an existing revision where they're named very similarly. I could provide I can rename it and provide a different name for it, just as I could in my workflow. I could also write a summary, call outs, links to a Jira ticket, same concept as we're now seeing in workflow, except the big key difference here is this happens when you hit save, right? Which is super important because number one, if someone has to go back and do this after the fact, it's just going to reduce the amount of people who are actually going to do that. It's additional steps. So this is exactly where you want to see it happen, is right at the time of save. And I imagine when this happens, this version description becomes available when the workflow runs, which we'll find out because I am just seeing these features just like you are for the first time, which is why this is kind of fun. So let's name it. We'll just say added workflow save signal start. Cool. Great. So now my workflow is saved. And I'm going to grab this workflow ID, and I'm going to pull up the submissions. And you'll see that just a few seconds ago, so this is UTC time, so it's a little bit ahead, right? It's not 8 o'clock yet. It's 4 hours ahead UTC. But this is right. It was 08:52. So this is the workflow event that fired when I did it, right? So, oh, sorry, no, that was on a module. So let me go and let me just make sure this is running. Oh, it's already started. Cool, which is why it ran, right? Let me just refresh. Cool. So I've got 2 workflow nodes starting now, and you could see that it did something here. So let's do one more thing. So we saved a version of the workflow, right? So now let's click the ellipses here. We see the settings, which is what we've always seen, and then we see version history. So now if I click version history, I'm going to get something very similar to what I was showing for modules, but I'm going to get it for this workflow. So now I can go back and I can preview each version. All right, I lied. I did just make sure it all worked first. Not that it wouldn't, but you can never be too sure when you're going on live TV. So I did make sure that it worked, and then I deleted it. But so exactly. So here's my revision. And then here was what it looked like in previous revisions. So this is what we started with today. And then I hit save with my note that and then I can restore, right? That's another great thing. Just like you can do with modules, you can go back to a specific point in time and you can roll back to a previous workflow. So this is going to be really key to integrate into some of the release management and the rollback capabilities of Unqork to be more inclusive of workflow as more and more applications are being built around workflows. Having the parity with what you can do with modules is important, and this is huge for you all as you're building workflow applications. You've got this really rich history, visual, and then the restoration abilities. Cool. So we've got our workflow, and let's get out of the version. Oops. And let's go back to the workflow itself. Okay, so what do we want to do? So now, great. Well, we have something firing off each and every time that a workflow is being saved, but of course, it's not doing anything yet. So we wanted to get it into GitLab. So let's start the process. Can't promise I'm going to finish the process, but let's at least get started. So I'll delete this node because I want to add in a new module. All right, and I'll connect this together. And then I'm going to create a new module. And we'll call this GitLab commit workflow API. And then I'll create it. Cool. Now I'll save my workflow. Added module for workflow save path. Save. Cool. I love this. I always know what I did without having to go look at the visual diff histories. Great. But there's nothing in here just yet. So let's start to do some stuff with it. So as a reference point, let's open up our module commit and see what the heck we did there. And let's, do a lot of the same. So let's actually just start by pasting some of the components over, because we're going to build an API module and it's probably going to be similar in nature. So let's just start grabbing the various sections of the config. And then we can, because that's what you always want to do, right? You want to you want to reuse as much as you possibly can. And then ultimately, you also want to keep your config dry. Ever folks heard of the phrase dry? It's an acronym, DRY. I think you all know how to spell dry, but I'll be super, very dry humor and tell you about it. But it means don't repeat yourself, right? Once you've done something once in software development, don't do the same thing again, because you should be able to use what you've already done. Now, I don't know how much we're going to have as an overlap here and how much we'll actually refactor. But if we weren't going, under the time crunch of a Twitch episode, I probably would think about taking aspects of this, pulling it out, and having some shared thing. And again, maybe we'll do it because I don't want to have repetitive configuration throughout my application. Because one of the main problems there, right, is if I have a problem, well, now I have to go fix that problem in 10 different places, right? I just thought of this, a really maybe funny example to highlight the problems with that is, remember in keyboarding class, so I'm not old enough to have taken typewriter class as my mom did, but in high school, they taught us how to type on a keyboard, right? I don't even know if they teach that anymore because I see a lot of people one fingering, and I mean, everyone's on their, touch devices now. So typing, with the QWERTY keyboard maybe isn't as well taught as it used to be. And plus kids are growing up with keyboards in their hands, basically. So they're probably pretty good even by the time they get there, and are probably fast enough without having to learn, all the things. Aunt Sally dates Fred, ASDF. You all remember Aunt Sally dates Fred? So long story short, it was in a keyboarding class. We had a substitute teacher one day, and the assignment that the substitute teacher gave us was basically just to sit there for 45 minutes and type the same thing, like same 5 paragraphs over and over and over again. Like type this sentence 10 times. So I taught the class, and it was kind of amazing that in 10th grade or whatever it was, the kids in the class didn't know this. Control C, Control V, or now Command C, Command V, because I'm a Mac user. Back then I was a PC user, copy paste, right? So I typed it once, and then I copy pasted it 9 more times, right? So then I was done with my assignment very early, and I just messed around for the remaining time of the class. However, when the teacher came back the following class, he knew that we all had copy pasted our answers or the assignment. How did he know? Because we would make a typo in our first sentence, and then we would copy paste that exact typo 9 more times, right? So that's the problem with copy pasting configuration, is if you have a problem in your source, you've now pasted it more times, and now you've got to go more places to fix up. So copy paste with caution and reuse where you can. Okay, so now let's just do one thing. I'm going to commit a workflow to GitLab on workflow save. So that's what we're going to do with this module now. All right, so what was happening in the request of this module? What was happening here was it was actually, I'm going to save this because I made a bunch of changes. So it is parsing out the event data. Okay, so if we look at our submissions here, going back to this workflow that fires, you'll see down in some of the older events, the ones that happened on a module save, it includes this event data. But if you look up here at the ones that we just did, well, it includes nothing because we didn't add anything in between the signal and the end. Nothing was happening, so nothing happened, right? We didn't add any data to our workflow. But down here, we have event data, which tells us what module, what archive, and what user, and at what time the module was saved. So there's going to be some similar event data available to me on a workflow save. So now let's come in. And what we're doing is, in order to get that data, we are looking at a special getter that's available to you only in the context of a module that lives in a workflow that has a signal start node called get event data. And what this is saying, for the event that triggered this signal start node to run, so a module save, app promotion, or workflow, here is an additional payload of data that tells me something about the event, right? Because if this workflow just got a notification that said a module was saved, but you didn't know what module was saved, it would be kind of a useless event, right? I don't know what to do with that data. I don't know anything about it. So we have to give you some context. So that's where get event data comes in. It gives you that context around what is saved. So that this should exist for a workflow. So let's just go in and let's add workflow ID, assuming that is what's going to get sent. And then I'm going to copy the whole event. And that's where you're seeing the entire event data. So let's come in. We're going to hit save here. And let's update this property ID now to say workflow ID. All right. And then this is an edit submission because it's running in a workflow, and then it's going to trigger a init config. So I'm just going to disable this initializer because I don't want anything else to happen just yet. I just want to make sure this basic logic of executing or getting the event data is working. Now, one thing to note here, because some of you might be looking at this and say, what is Nick doing? Why does he have an edit and a new submission trigger? So let's actually look at that. So in my edit submission trigger, you'll see this runs on edit submission, and it does a calc request, and then it does the config, and then it does triggers the init config. Okay, so it calculates that request. Which, what did that do again? That's what pulled out that event data. I switch over to request new, and you see all that actually does is trigger event init config, and it runs on new submission. Why is that? The reason for that is I wanted this module to be very flexible. Whereas 99% of the time, this module is going to run in the context of a workflow event. And when workflow tasks get executed, there is already a submission. Therefore, I want to use the edit submission trigger. Because the moment that this signal start node is invoked, a submission for that workflow is created. So when this module gets executed, it is executing in the context of a submission. But this is, and going back to my points around reusability, right? Something like committing a module to a source control repository is something that you may not always want to just happen. Oh, look at that. I've been editing my wrong module here. Workflow. This is another great reason for reuse, because then you might accidentally mess with the wrong one. So let me go back and let me revert the changes. And actually, you know what? I'm not going to do this. Let me do this instead. We were just talking about version history and how important a version history is. What did I just realize I did? Whoops, I just edited the wrong module. But fortunately, I have a history of all the changes that have been made to this module. So if I just refresh this, although I'm pretty sure I just clicked it, short-term memory loss, getting old. I actually haven't touched this since July 25th. So this is my last version. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to restore. All right. Why can't I restore this version? I want to restore this version. Okay. That's odd. Well, I can restore this version, but then there's this version after it. I wonder what I changed. Let's go find out what I changed. This is a fun little aside. So let's go into module revisions. So now, why am I going to module revisions? If you recall back some of our UDLC talks, this here is going to give you the breakdown of changes. And it, at times, depending on the type of change that you made, it's going to highlight components that you added or deleted, but it's not going to highlight specific changes to the components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into module revisions, and I want to compare this one to this one. And so let me do that. And let me see specifically what it is I changed. Now, if I was following good practices like we were showing with the workflow and I was writing a message when I was hitting save, I should know this because I would have said it. All right, so nothing saved. So, there's a very good chance that what I did here was I was testing that when I save this module, it's going to send it off to GitLab. So that's probably why I didn't actually go and change anything. So with that being said, it is totally safe for me to restore this version. So I'm going to restore this version. I'll come back. I'll refresh this page. And cool, I'm back to my module version. All right, so now I'm going to hop over to my workflow one where I wanted to be before. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to make this workflow ID, same changes I just did a second ago, workflow ID. And then I'll save that. And then I'll come in here and I will say workflow ID, because that's the workflow ID. All right, and then over here is where I'm going to disable my initializer. Cool. So now that should all be good. Now, again, so where I was going when I got off on that little tangent because I realized I was messing with the wrong module is that I want this to be a flexible endpoint, and the idea of just committing a module's configuration into source control is something that I might want to do in an automated fashion through a workflow, but also potentially do on an ad hoc basis. So this module is accessible both via a workflow using the edit submission, as well as via a general API call executing a module as an API, at which point it's going to be a new submission trigger because there isn't going to be a submission that it's going to act in. So if I'm going to do this from a server-side execution, I would actually just be passing the module ID in the request body, at which point I don't need to go through the process and extract the module ID from the event data. I have it immediately because that's how I invoked the module, that's how I executed the module. Okay, so now I've updated the workflow module, and now it's going to be saving that event data. And the reason for that is I have store data in database checked on the event, which means when the workflow executes, it's going to save any of the data where you have that setting selected to your workflow submission. So now if I hop back and I save this workflow again, and I'm not going to add a message here because I didn't do anything. Cool, it's saved. So now if I shoot over to my submissions, cool. Now I've got my event data, right? So this is the data that comes through when a workflow is saved. The workflow that is saved, super important, the timestamp, and the user ID. Now, we were working on this in parallel. We're going to get the archive ID in there because we'll want that. Now that we have the workflow version history too, we'll want the specific version of the workflow, but we're going to be able to do what we need to do based on the workflow ID alone, but no harm in having as much data as possible. Data is good. So now we've got this firing. We understand the workflow ID. So now we should be able to go ahead and we should be able to configure the process to kick it over to GitHub or GitLab in this case. Okay, so the first thing that my module version was doing is it was, well, getting the modules, getting the configuration of the module. Okay, now this is leveraging a UDLC API to get the modules config, where I just pass the module ID in. We don't have a UDLC API right now to get the workflow, but of course we have of course the API exists. We just don't have a config version sitting in front of it. And how am I going to figure out what that API is? Well, I'm going to put my hacker hat on for a second, and I'm just going to go into my network, and I'm going to go back to the workflow edit page, right? I'm just going to refresh it, and I'm going to see what happens. All right, so these are all the requests that are happening, and now I should be able to do this. And what do I get in here? I got a few things. So this is a get workspaces. That's getting my application. I don't need that. Application workflows. Okay, this looks like an endpoint that I want, right? It's getting, and it follows a very standard RESTful URL pattern saying I want to get the element that I want to get is workflows, and the ID of the workflow I want to get is the ID of the workflow, right? Now, if I remove, you've probably seen this pattern all over, right? If I just had workflows, it would give me a list of workflows. If I have workflows / an ID, then it gives me that specific workflow. Very standard. So this is the endpoint I want, right? This is what's going to give me back the JSON for my workflow. Okay. So if I come back over here, and I'm just going to grab this section of the URL because this is the endpoint we want to hit. And I'm just going to clear that out. And let's just drop this in. Okay. But instead, I'm going to put in dynamically the workflow ID, right? Because I want to get the workflow and it should still, I want to get the workflow that I'm saving. That was saved in that event data. So again, this workflow ID came from that event data. So I know that this is the workflow that triggered this dynamic process to run. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to switch it over to a get request because I'm not executing that module. And I don't need to pass any parameters in because the parameter is in the URL. But let's see what information we might want to extract out of this, if any. So looking at the structure of the data, it's going to come back to me as one large object. In reality, I want everything in that object. So it doesn't really make sense for me to necessarily map specific fields out. I'm going to ultimately just work with this entire workflow plugin's response because the response of this plugin is the workflow. So cool. So I got that. I don't need this anymore. Now, what is this? The workflow app ID. So what this was doing here is plug app enabled. So this was actually determining whether or not the application that hosts the module or holds the module that I've saved is enabled for integration with GitLab. Right. So if I actually switch back to my application, I go to my data collection. I have a data collection here called GitLab apps. Right. And what this does is it just allows you to define which apps you want to have integrated, part of this integration, and then which project ID you want to send that data to. So the project ID lives inside of GitLab. It's the repository identifier, basically. Right. So this is saying for this application, I want to send anything about it to this project in my GitLab. Okay, now this application is the application that we're working on, of course, right? Now, why did I do that to begin with? The reason I did that to begin with is if we go back to the workflow, we have, again, for these signals, we have triggering event, all modules, specific module, all applications, specific, all workflow, specific workflow. Now, in the case of modules, there could be many, many, many modules in a given application. And typically that application level is where you want to be, making these decisions to say whether I want this whole app pushed over to GitLab. So what I didn't want to have to do, of course, is you don't want to have a separate, if I had selected specific module, well, then I need a signal start node for every module in that app. And then if I add a new module, I have to go add a new signal start node. That doesn't really make any sense. So I had to do all modules which does make sense. But I don't want it to be every module in the entire system. I only care about certain modules, and I'm going to define what certain modules are through this table. I want every module inside of this app. Okay, so maybe there'll be a future state where you have triggering event on modules in specific app or in workflow. I mean, you can think about everything at different levels of hierarchy, but the nice thing is you don't actually need it in order to get to achieve the desired functionality that you want, because you can extract that data at runtime and figure it all out, because all of that is represented in the codeless definition, which is transparent and portable and so on and so forth. So I have access to what I need. As great as it might be for the Unqork platform to include it, you don't need it, right? And that's the beautiful thing about Unqork is it's a development platform. If it does not have a feature that you would like, there's a very good chance that you can build it yourself. So that's what we're doing, right? So we have a workflow save, and we want to, again, validate that it's in the app. So that's what we're doing in a module. And we're probably, you know what, so whereas I actually pulled out, and if I go back and I look at the other version, I did pull out a couple fields previously in order to determine which app it was in. I extracted that information from the data inside the module about which workspace and application it's part of. So maybe I actually want to continue to do that. So let me go look into my data. And sure enough, in the workflow definition, there is an application ID and there is a workspace ID. So since I'm going to be using that in my subsequent logic to determine whether or not it's enabled, I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to add those lines back in. So this would be on the output, workspace ID, application ID, and that's actually just going to be mapping it to fields that are named exactly the same thing. Oh, no, I named it app ID for brevity. So there we go. So now I'm just going to map out workspace ID and application ID from these fields here into those fields, which will then have my logic to say whether or not the app is enabled is still going to run. Okay. So it's going to check to make sure that my app is included in this data collection of apps. And then it's going to go and it's going to actually do it. Okay. So what happens next? So what happens next, I'm calling it the prepare. Oh, this is called the get module. You know what? We'll call this get workflow. Right. And maybe if I had named it something like get element, I wouldn't have to rename it because I made it more generic. Again, thinking about reuse, maybe there's a way to make this. So again, so here's a perfect example. This logic did not change. Right. Checking about whether or not it's enabled didn't change, but now I have this logic here and I have this logic over here, right? But the inputs to the logic of has my app changed are the same, right? It says get a workspace, get an app, and tell me if it's enabled. And then so I did reuse some of that logic by making the process to say is an app enabled an API to say, hey, give me an app ID and I'll tell you if it's enabled and also what project ID it's a part of or just part of a full details array. But since this is the same too, maybe there's a better way to do this, right? Maybe I could take more of this logic and embed it into here or import this panel since, you know, some of the decisioning such as the rule commit is, you know, consistent across, right? Or maybe here's an interesting thing. Like, so again, I'm mapping this field out. Maybe I want to do something to the effect of saying, if the app isn't enabled, leveraging other new capabilities of Unqork, like custom HTTP status codes, I could say if the app's not enabled, maybe I return a 404 status, like a not found, like this app is not found in the enabled apps. And if it is enabled, I return a 200 status, at which point the plugin that does this call, you know, can trigger rule commit on success and nothing, or sorry, trigger whatever rule commit does. So just, you know, thought I'd go off on that little tangent because I am noticing myself repeating myself. That being said, in the interest of time, which honestly, I hate to say that because that is typically how you end up repeating yourself is in the interest of time. It's way easier to just copy paste some stuff and make a change than it is to like refactor both places that you've done it. Understand I'm doing this for TV purposes, and I'm most likely, if not 100%, going to go back and refactor some of this after we get off the Twitch. So now I'll go here again and I'll say prepare workflow. And so what is this doing? It's stringifying my workflow. Okay. And ooh, I can actually make this smarter. But what it's doing is, so it's actually not stringifying it in the way that you might think, right? Because there is an Unqork formula, like one of those Excel looking formulas called stringify, which will take a JSON object and it will stringify it into a string representation of a JSON object, which can then be parsed later on by something that wants to parse it back into a JSON object. But I'm not doing that via the stringify function formula. Why? Because the stringify formula on Unqork actually doesn't give you the ability to control how that string looks, right? It's going to give you one long string back, which is totally fine when you're just talking about stringifying and parsing later. Doesn't matter whether or not there are line breaks in the string, it's going to parse back to JSON very cleanly. However, while building this GitLab integration, what we saw was if we stringify without line breaks, then inside of GitLab, it's one massive long string, which means if I change one property, the diffing capabilities of Git are going to tell you that your entire configuration changed because you made a change to one line, but the whole config is represented in one line. So instead, we want to add in the line breaks, those /n, \n delimiters that you've probably seen. We want to add an actual carriage return. So then the Git tools are going to see each line as an independent element. So if I go and I change like one setting of one component, that's only going to impact the one line of JSON that's actually being edited. And I will see that specific diff versus a full-blown diff. So in order to do that, I'm actually executing a formulas API module. So this is a module that I built that handles like custom formulas, so to speak. And there's actually even a better way to do this now but I'm just going to go and I'm going to show the module anyway. If I go into formulas API, and inside of it, it's a transform. And I go to transforms and I go to stringify. And what is it doing? It is using nunjucks to stringify, because nunjucks, their dump formatter of nunjucks gives you the ability to pass in a delimiter. And the \t, this is actually a tab delimiter, but the way that it understands \t is tab or new line. So by stringifying it this way, I get the line breaks. Okay, so I actually want to just do that, right? I want to stringify my workflow. Okay, so in the previous version, I had output my module definition to a property called module, but I didn't need to do that here because, again, I want that whole workflow definition. So instead, I'm just going to pass in, plug workflow, because plug workflow is going to have my it's going to have my whole thing. So now I'm going to call this stringified, because this was again thinking ahead to how I could repurpose a lot of this. If I call it module content, and then I do it again, I call it workflow content, and I do it again, I call it something else content. That's not very reusable. Something like stringified is a little more reusable. So I'm going to update this to call stringified. And then I'm going to have to, though, update that elsewhere. So module content, that's now called stringified. Let me just save that. So now I'm getting back my stringified version. So what I'm actually going to do here, though, is I'm going to turn the store data in database on. Looking at the time, I don't think I'm going to get through everything, but I want to just show some stuff. So I'm going to re-enable this initializer so some of that additional logic runs. And then though I'm going to, so plug stringify, I'm assuming it's gonna call a init commit after. So we want up to this point. So at this point, I'm gonna disable execution. Kind of like a breakpoint, right? Thinking about folks putting breakpoints in their code to see what happens up until a certain point. This is what I'm doing. I'm breaking my execution at init commit. All right, cool. So now I've saved, and now I'm going to go back. I'm going to save my workflow again. Cool. And if I go and I refresh, oh, something didn't go as planned. So where did I get cut off here? Commit module. I ran oh, I know what I did. I did not update this to say plug workflow. I kept it as plug module. Again, probably should rename this to be like plug JSON or something, or plug definition, because it's a workflow definition or module definition. So I have a reusable term like that. So now let me go save, and I'll come over here and I'll save this workflow again. All right, and now if I come back, oh, boom, there it is, right? So here now is my stringified version of my workflow. So this is the JSON config. The Unqork codeless definition of my GitLab workflow is now stored in stringified content, which is going to enable me to send it over to GitLab. And you'll see here it added in /n/t/n, new line /t is tab. So that's where what you actually see is /n/tt. So it's also smart enough to understand the nestingness of the JSON. So you don't just get JSON that has a new thing on each line. You get JSON that has a new thing on each line properly indented so it looks like this does, right? Data, raw data, event, workflow ID, right? The proper nesting. So this is our formatted string version of the workflow. And now we want to go and we want to send it off to GitLab. So let's see if we can get this done in a few minutes. So I'll open up. So this is my calc commit. So what was happening in here is it was calculating where I'm going to put everything, right? What the path to the file is, what the content is. So where am I going to put this? I'm going to put this, the file path. I'm going to put in workspaces, applications, modules. Nope. I'll put in workflows. And I want to get the ID of the workflow, and I'm going to make my file name workflowid.json. Okay, now the workflow ID, not the archive ID being the version. I just want to continue to update the same version, right? So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, all right, well, where is it? And I want the ID, right? That's the ID. So it's called a property called just ID versus the _ID I saw in module. So I was going to come in here. I'm going to remove that. Now down here, I'm going to do the same thing. Workflows, and then ID. Now you'll probably looking at this and saying, hey, Nick, why didn't you just use like a URL encoding formula? I don't remember, to be totally honest. So I just wrote it out twice. It was simple enough. They were right next to one another. And all I really needed to do is change slashes to %2fs. So I just did it simply there. And then, okay, so then my content here, I want to update so what did I do here? So in this case, I did a couple things. First and foremost is I am replacing the an @ quote with an actual quote. Okay, now this is because the stringified does in HTML encodes it as well with HTML entities. So $QUOT comma or semicolon is the HTML entity for a quote. Right. So because the thing is, if you're writing HTML, you have a lot of quotes that you use. Right. You use quotes to wrap your values and things like that in the HTML. So when you actually want to put a quote in, it's usually good to do it as an HTML entity. It also avoids like cross-site scripting attacks and things like that. So basically by doing this, it's a safe version of a quote. But we actually want the raw quote because that's what we want to show up in the file in GitLab. So we're just going to convert that very easily back into a actual quote. And then I'm base64 encoding it because that's what the API wants. And then it's going to say commit archive, some committing a specific archive of the module, which is what I'm going to do for my workflow here. And let's just go in and let's see, where is that? Do I have that data readily available for me here? Lock, owner, node array, nodes. So it doesn't seem like that's immediately available to me just on the workflow data itself. Now I'm taking the short version here. I probably want to be doing this based off of the version history, where it obviously will have unique IDs. But for the purposes of this, we're just going to put the ID in again, commit workflow, and we'll just put the ID in. All right, so now we, in theory, should have updated our content. And actually, what I noticed I didn't update was I had updated the property module content to say stringified. So I want to make sure I'm doing the same thing down here. So I changed stringified. So then over here, I want to output that back into stringified. And just for the sake, you know what? I'm going to start the process of my refactoring. Call this file path. And I'm going to call this then file path encoded. And then I'll call this message. Okay. So then back in this calc, just going to change some of those. So over here, I want to just say file path. File path encoded and message. All right, cool. So that should be all done. Wait, let me just, since I think we're going to get through this, let me turn this back on. Now let me go down to plug branch. And what this is doing is just getting the current branch based on my environment. So that doesn't need to change. Again, here's things that I could reuse. App project ID, file. I'm just going to change that to file path encoded now. And then down here, branch ref, all good. That looks all fine. And now let's go down to commit create, module action. We're going to leave that as is. Commit update, module action update. Okay, so what's actually, again, I should probably change this to action. We'll just do that. So what this is doing is actually, it's determining what kind of action I actually want to do. So this plug file, it's basically going to hit GitLab and it's going to say, hey, does this file exist, right, at this branch? Has this workflow been committed already? And it's going to, just similar to what I said before about how one way to maybe refactor that app enabled endpoint would be to return a successful status code or a non-successful status code. That's what GitLab does. If the file exists, it sends me a successful status code. If the file doesn't exist, it sends me a non-successful status code. So that's where I said file exists. We're going to update it. File doesn't exist. We're going to create it. Okay. So I called that action now, which means in my inits, I'm just going to have to go action. And then in my other one, I will just go action. I'll save it. Plug commit. So in here, I'm going to go in and what do I need to change? I need to change this. It says action or message. This says action. This is now just file path. This is now just stringified. And then that's it. All right. Save. Save. And the moment of truth. So let me hop over to my GitLab repository here, sign in. Okay, here's my project. And you'll see, what you should see is if I go actually into my repository commits and I switch to my codeless staging branch, get the environment I'm in, the entire time that we've been working, we've been committing the modules that I've been changing, right? So this here is the module I was messing around with, right? So I changed module to plug workflow. These are the changes I did, right? This is exactly what you just saw me do. I changed the outputs from module file path to file path, right? So this is my commit diff. And you see that, again, everything's on a specific line with proper indenting versus just being one massive file. So now I can view my changes in this, textual diff, and then a pipeline ran. Hooray, it passed. Cool. So now I'm going to go back and drum roll, moment of truth. I should now, assuming this all worked, I should be able to come in here and I should be able to, I want to go back to, I'm done with version history. Cool. I'm going to hit save and let's say testing the commit. I save. And let me just go over here. I should have a new thing. Stringify is now this base 64. This reminds, so this is a good thing. I want to go in and I want to disable this. I don't need to save the stringified value in my workflow anymore. And that's just another like submission, particularly like submission revisions. Something that's, probably overlooked is it's a great way to do testing and debugging your stuff. Like look at your submission data and you'll be like, oh shoot, I have stringified in here. I don't want stringified in here. That's going to add a lot of bloat to my submission size. So peeking at submission, made me realize, oh darn, I got to go back and uncheck that box. And now the moment of truth, if I go over here, commit workflow, committed just now, new file, and bam, there it is. My workflow data now exists inside of Git. Let's jump back over. Let's make a change here and let's, what do I want to do? Let's just, I want to do something. Here, let me check this. If I go edit here, I had this called GitLab commit module. Let me edit this and let me change the path. GitLab commit workflow. And let me save update path to workflow module. Save that. Successfully saved. Come over here. Got a brand new event. It has a commit ID. It has no stringified data. Hooray. I come back over here. I go back to my commits. Go back to codeless staging. I've got a new one, commit workflow. I look at it, and sure enough, here are my diffs. So, so this is some stuff you probably don't care about, right? It's a location but this is what we did, right? What did I do? I actually went in and I changed the path. And now I can see it used to be called GitLab Commit Workflow API. I changed it to GitLab Commit Workflow, and you can see exactly what changed in the underlying JSON that represents your workflow. So that's it, done. I did it. I did my work, and I hope that was fun to see some actual work happen, and then also to see again 2 really exciting new features of Unqork: workflow version history and the workflow save signal start node. And then an example of something that you can do with it. One of the many things that you'll be able to do with both of those things, particularly both of those things together. But I'm really excited to see these things hit our servers, and the ideation is only going to just begin. Well, I don't want to say that. Our product team certainly has been ideating on things to do with this from the start. But now for our creators to do exactly the same, I hope that's how folks, go into getting a new feature of Unqork. And if you don't, I just encourage you, like a new feature comes out, and don't just look at it for what it is, right? And what it is going to be great. That's why we chose to do it, and that's why we chose to put it into the platform. But think about what else you can do with it, right? Because again, with Unqork being that development platform, the possibilities truly are endless and all that. So I hope that was a good time for you. I'm glad I got some work done. I'm headed off on vacation until the 12th. So there will be no Uncoder session with me next week. Maybe we'll have a fill-in guest. I don't know. I'll talk to my producers about that. But I'll see you again in a couple weeks when I'm back in the States and twitching away. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.